Um, Greetings, everybody. So what I thought I would do is share a little bit about sort of an approach to sort of what a class and sort of technology entrepreneurship. Of course, I would teach would be something along the lines of sort of designing and building entrepreneurial organizations. Done a lot of work studying tech entrepreneurship and talking to founders and folks as they build companies and have done so talk a lot about sort of how do you take a technology and sort of build a company around it, and what are the challenges of that, both from the perspective of founders and of course also from the people perspective of people working inside those organizations. So I want to talk about sort of organizational design and sort of how we think about designing organizations. Now, I think that one of the things, this is a really important topic, is because a good organizational design that sort of really works with the technology and the people in the company is a great competitive advantage. It's hard to imitate, but it's really not easy to do. It's a really requires a different way of thinking and being very deliberate about thinking about what should the company look like, how should it be structured, how should it be designed, and so what I think the first sort of step in this class would be to sort of try and do a bit of a mind shift, and thinking about, what motivates our employees, ourselves, the people around us, and how do we think about motivating people in ways that are going to be effective for an organization. So a typical model of motivation would say, individuals we have our interests, our needs, our personalities, our values, and that leads us to feel a certain way, to have a certain set of goals, a certain set of attitudes, and from that we act. We make choices, we do things. And this is a pretty common way of thinking about motivation, right? Our personality shapes our attitudes, shapes our behavior. The challenge with that is that it doesn't actually work very well. It's actually very hard from a management perspective to work with that, right? You have to have the right set of people. Once they're there, they're going to do what you want them to do. But what if there's a mismatch? How do you encourage people to act in a way that is going to be effective, right? We're not going to change their personality, so what are we supposed to do? But it's actually very intuitive. It makes us feel like, okay, I know a person and I know how they're going to actually act. So it's why this model has sort of stuck around as much as it has. So, Nelson mentioned that I, recently joined the faculty at Santa Barbara, and so I might, making that decision, I might say, gosh, I really like technology. I like studying technology. I like the beach. I like being outdoors, and so I feel really good about this place, and that's going to lead me to decide to join Santa Barbara. Um, a typical way of thinking about how do we make decisions. But there's a very famous study done at Stanford many years ago now. Some of you may have heard of it. There was a movie made about this Stanford prison experiment. And what this psychologist did, Phil Zimbardo, is he created a prison in the basement of Stanford University, and he randomly assigned people to different roles, half of them to prisoners and half of them to prison guards, and then looked to see what happened. And people said things like this first quote here, I was surprised at myself. I made them, the prisoners, call each other names and clean the toilet out with their bare hands. I practically considered the prisoners cattle. And so these prison guards sort of surprise themselves in how they act. It didn't fit their personality, their expectation, their understanding of themselves, and it's quite a puzzle. But it provides us with an alternative mode of thinking, a motivation, right? We work in settings that are structured in a particular way to do a particular thing. We're rewarded for certain behaviors. Our leaders and our managers are telling us certain things, and that gets us focused on certain things, tasks, focused on certain information, and different objectives. And from there, it actually then shapes what we do, and the choices we make and the behaviors we engage in. So sort of like a backwards way of thinking about a traditional model of motivation. right? That the context we're in shapes our behavior, shapes our attitudes. So to go back to my example of my decision to join Santa Barbara, I might say, I maybe I'm not an outdoorsy person, but I really want to be. By putting myself in living in Santa Barbara, I am now outside. I'm not sure I'm going to learn to surf, but maybe that just being in that environment is going to lead me to a set of behaviors and doing things that's going to change the way I actually think about myself, right? I'm going to think of myself in a new way because this context in which I've situated myself has changed my behavior and then actually changed my attitudes and my beliefs. So it's an alternative way of thinking about motivation. And it's very useful for management and very useful for thinking about how to manage a firm. And that's because what we have this idea of, employees, we want to shape people's attitudes and behaviors. I mean, sorry, what we see are people's attitudes and behaviors. What we don't see is where they come from, right? So our intuition says it's coming from people's personalities and beliefs. But what we don't see is how much the things that are happening in organizations, the rewards, the roles, the background, the culture, all of those things are shaping people too. So what we're going to talk about a lot in a class on building entrepreneurial organizations is there's certainly a selection process and how do you decide who to hire. That's a very important process in organizations, but there's also a lot of managerial decisions that are about designing the context and that sort of organizational design. So the question is, what kind of company do you want to create? What kind of company do you want to work in? And to understand what that company is going to be, what that company is gonna look like, you think a lot about the context. And so these are all here the design levers, I call them, right, to manage context. And so in a class like building entrepreneurial organizations, we're going to spend a week talking about, these various topics, things like recruitment and selection, as I said, very important, but also teams and job design. Nelson mentioned there's a whole class on managing technology teams. How you design those teams, right? Very important to understanding how people are going to act. Things about physical space, training, things that managers sort of do and say. What do we measure? What are the things that we're paying attention to in a performance management system? How do we get people to share information in organizations? How do we reward them? What kinds of behavior do we recognize? And then, of course, compensation. That's something that everyone thinks about as a motivating factor, and it's absolutely important. And we talk about that. But we're also going to talk about all of these other kinds of things that managers do to shape the context and shape the behaviors and the behaviors, the choices, the attitudes, things that happen inside organizations. So I just wanted to give you an example of sort of how we might think about sort of building an entrepreneurial organization and how we might think about organizational design as a way of, you start with the technology and you have to build, you build a whole organization around it in order to be able to accomplish your goal. And these are the kinds of levers that exist to work on those things. So I did a lot of work on entrepreneurial teams in Silicon Valley, and a lot of these kinds of these ideas, the cases, you do cases on a lot of these different topics. They come from sort of tech companies and how they approached compensation, how they approached building an organizational culture, how they approached measurement and behaviors to measure in organizations.